Have you ever wondered why, when countries trade goods like oil or coffee, they often use US dollars? It's a question that takes us back to the end of World War II. The world was in ruins, and nations needed a stable way to rebuild and trade. The old systems were shattered. Europe's economies were devastated and its currencies were weak. The United States, however, emerged from the war with its industrial base intact and booming. It held the vast majority of the world's gold reserves, a crucial factor in the financial thinking of the time. This unique position set the stage for a new global financial architecture, one where America would play the leading role, and its currency would become central. In 1944, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. Their goal was ambitious: to create a new international monetary system. This system needed to prevent the kind of economic chaos that had contributed to 2 world wars. They needed a reliable anchor, a currency everyone could trust. The choice fell, almost inevitably, to the US dollar. America's economic might was undeniable. Its commitment to open markets, at least in principle, was also appealing. The Bretton Woods Agreement established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, but its most profound decision was making the dollar the world's reserve currency. The genius of the Bretton Woods system, and the key to the dollar's acceptance, was its link to gold. The United States government promised that other countries could exchange their US dollars for gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This meant the dollar was, quite literally, as good as gold. This gold backing provided immense confidence. Other countries, in turn, pegged their currencies to the US dollar. This created a stable and predictable framework for international trade and investment. For nations recovering from war, this stability was paramount. It allowed them to plan, to borrow, and to rebuild with a degree of certainty that had been missing for decades. This new system worked remarkably well for about 25 years. It fueled an unprecedented period of global economic growth, often called the post-war economic boom, or Les Trente Glorieuses in France. International trade flourished. Countries could import essential goods and export their products, knowing the value of the transactions was secure. The dollar wasn't just an American currency anymore, it was the bedrock of global commerce. This stability, however, depended heavily on the US maintaining its economic discipline and its vast gold reserves. As the world changed and America's own circumstances evolved, the foundations of this golden era for the dollar began to show cracks. By the late 1960s, the Bretton Woods system faced severe strains. The United States was spending enormous sums of money. The Vietnam War was costly, both in lives and treasure. President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, while aiming to reduce poverty and inequality, also added to government expenditure. Other countries, particularly in Europe, had rebuilt their economies and were becoming more competitive. They started accumulating dollars, and some, like France under Charles de Gaulle, grew wary of America's exorbitant privilege and began to demand gold for their dollar holdings, as was their right under the agreement. America's gold reserves started to dwindle, putting the $35 per ounce promise under immense pressure. The breaking point came on August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon made a stunning announcement on television. He declared that the United States would unilaterally suspend the convertibility of the US dollar into gold. This move, often called the Nixon shock, effectively ended the Bretton Woods system. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It became a fiat currency, its value determined by government policy and market trust rather than a physical commodity. This decision sent shockwaves through the global financial system. Currencies that had been pegged to the dollar were suddenly floating, and a period of great uncertainty began. Many feared this would destabilize international trade. However, the US dollar didn't collapse. Instead, a new arrangement emerged, one that would prove just as crucial to maintaining its dominance: the Petrodollar system. In the early 1970s, a period marked by an oil crisis and rising energy prices, the US struck a series of agreements, most notably with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter at the time. Under these arrangements, Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exports exclusively in US dollars. In return, the US offered military aid and protection. Other OPEC nations soon followed suit, pricing their oil in dollars. This was a masterstroke for American financial power. This petrodollar recycling mechanism created a constant, massive global demand for US dollars. Any country wanting to buy oil, a vital commodity for every modern economy, first needed to acquire US dollars. These dollars paid to oil-producing nations were then often reinvested in US government bonds or other US assets, further strengthening the American economy and its currency. So, while the gold backing was gone, it was replaced by a de facto oil backing. This ingenious shift ensured that despite the end of Bretton Woods, the dollar remained the undisputed king of global finance, essential for the lifeblood of international commerce: energy. The dominance of the US dollar in global trade and finance grants the United States significant and unique advantages. One of the most potent is the ability to exert political and economic pressure through financial sanctions. Because so many international transactions are cleared through US banks or involve US dollars, Washington can effectively cut off countries, companies, or individuals from the global financial system. This has become a powerful foreign policy tool, used against nations like Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Few other countries possess this kind of far-reaching economic leverage, making the dollar a key instrument of American global influence. This central role also provides what former French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously called America's exorbitant privilege. The US can borrow money more cheaply than other nations because there's always a high demand for dollar-denominated assets, like US Treasury bonds. When the US government needs to finance its deficits, it can simply print more dollars, knowing that much of the world needs them. Furthermore, American businesses and consumers face less risk from exchange rate fluctuations when conducting international trade or travel, as many prices are already in dollars. This translates into tangible economic benefits for the United States. For other countries, the dollar's dominance is a mixed blessing. On one hand, it provides a stable and liquid currency for international trade and investment, simplifying transactions and reducing uncertainty. Many central banks around the world hold vast quantities of US dollars as foreign exchange reserves, which helps stabilize their own currencies and economies. However, this reliance also makes them vulnerable to US monetary policy. When the Federal Reserve adjusts interest rates, for example, it can have significant ripple effects across the globe, influencing borrowing costs and capital flows in other nations, sometimes to their detriment. Moreover, the necessity of holding dollars means that global economic events, or even shifts in US domestic policy, can impact the value of other countries' reserves. If the dollar weakens, the value of those reserves declines. This creates a complex interdependence where the world relies on the dollar, and the US benefits from that reliance, but it also carries responsibilities and potential risks for all parties involved. The system has facilitated global growth, but its inherent imbalances are a constant subject of international discussion and, at times, tension, especially when US interests diverge from those of other major economies. Despite its entrenched position, the US dollar's supremacy is facing a growing number of challenges in the 21st century. Some of the world's major economic powers, notably China and Russia, have become increasingly vocal about their desire to reduce their dependence on the dollar. They view dollar dominance as a tool of American geopolitical power and seek to create a more multipolar international monetary system. These efforts are driven by a desire for greater economic sovereignty and to insulate themselves from US sanctions or financial pressure. This is not just rhetoric. Concrete steps are being taken, albeit slowly, to chip away at the dollar's ubiquity in global transactions. One clear trend is the increasing use of bilateral currency swap agreements between countries, allowing them to trade directly using their own currencies, bypassing the dollar altogether. For example, China has been actively promoting the use of its currency, the renminbi or yuan, in international trade and finance. It has established numerous currency swap lines with other central banks, and is developing its own cross-border payment system, CIPS. As an alternative to SWIFT, which is heavily influenced by the US. Russia has also made efforts to de-dollarize its economy, particularly in its energy trade with countries like China and India, often settling payments in rubles, yuan, or other currencies. The rise of digital currencies presents another potential challenge, or at least a complicating factor, for the dollar's traditional role. Central bank digital currencies are being explored or developed by many nations, including China, with its digital yuan. These could facilitate faster, cheaper cross-border payments and potentially reduce reliance on existing dollar-based infrastructure. While a US digital dollar is also under consideration, the rapid development of CBDCs elsewhere could fragment the international payment landscape. Private cryptocurrencies, though volatile, also hint at a future where non-state forms of money could play a larger role, though their widespread adoption for mainstream global trade remains uncertain. So, will the US dollar maintain its undisputed top spot in the decades to come? Or are we witnessing the slow dawn of a new era with multiple influential currencies? The dollar's advantages, deep liquid financial markets, the size of the US economy, and general trust, are formidable. However, the geopolitical landscape is shifting, and technological innovations are relentless. The future of global money is likely to be more complex than the relatively simple dollar-centric system of the past. Whether this leads to a gradual erosion of the dollar's preeminence, or a more dramatic reordering of the financial world remains one of the most important questions for the 21st century global economy.